Good evening. Thank you to Temple Emmanuel for serving as our host this evening. Just last week, we at AJC released the most comprehensive survey ever done of American Jews on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. The survey, which you can find in these handy booklets right outside, revealed some disturbing findings. We see that 9 out of 10 American Jews are deeply concerned about anti-Semitism in this country. That 84% believe that anti-Semitism has gotten worse over the past 5 years. 1 out of every 3 American Jews has concealed his or her Jewishness at some time. Now, these statistics were deeply troubling to all of us who followed the subject of anti-Semitism in America, but they came as no news to our brothers and sisters overseas. Indeed, the situation that we are encountering today in the United States has been the reality for many European Jews for quite a few years now. From attacks at Jewish schools and supermarkets to an attack just recently at a synagogue in Halle, Germany, to daily harassment in the streets of European capitals, European Jews have been living in a state of deep insecurity for many years. So here with us today, we have 2 prominent European Jews who are at the very forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism in Europe. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Schwamenthal and Simone Rodan-Benzaquen. Daniel, I'd actually like to start with you. Some months ago, you and I were together in Brussels, and you shared an anecdote that I found deeply moving and quite troubling about your experience, not only as a Jew, but as a Jewish father in Europe. Could you please share that with our audience today?
Right, thank you, Avi. As parents, we had to make a decision of whether to send our kids to a Jewish school or to a normal public school. Ultimately, we decided to send our kids to a Jewish school, and we lived throughout the sort of anxieties that many Jewish parents have in our situation of whether we are very, responsible Jewish parents to give our kids a Jewish education, or whether we are very irresponsible parents by exposing our kids to a very particular danger. I come from Germany, and as long as I can remember, Jewish institutions had to be protected by police. And this is also the case of the Jewish school where our kids go in Brussels. And it actually includes a preschool. So they have been going there since they were both 2 years old. They are now 10 and 8. Our oldest asked when he was about 3 why there was police in front of the school. At the time there was police. This has been by now replaced by, after the terror attacks in Brussels, by military personnel. And, a 3-year-old, so we told them a sweet little white lie that the police is there to protect the toys in his kindergarten. Now, I don't have to explain to this audience here that my kid is, of course, inevitably a little genius. And so one day we walked by the school on a weekend when it was closed, and obviously there was no school, there were no police there. And he asked us, wait a minute, the school is now empty. Wouldn't it be much more important to have the police now? So I don't remember actually anymore how we got out of this situation. And I was already dragging the day when I would have had to have the talk with my son. But I think about when he was 5 years old and we still hadn't really explained to him, he just came home one day and he said, I know why the police is there. And that's it.
Thank you, Daniel. Now, Simone, your kids are actually in the audience today.
2 of them, they are.
2 of them. Could you share with us a little bit how your perspective and your experience differs from Daniel's?
Sure. So first of all, I think what Daniel and I are going through, most Jewish parents are going through in Europe. Meaning that we have to ask ourselves what the most responsible thing to do is as a parent. I made a different choice. I decided to take my kids not to Jewish school, particularly after Toulouse. I don't know if all of you know, Toulouse was a terrorist attack against a Jewish school in 2012, where a Islamist terrorist went into the school, killed 3 Jewish school children and a teacher. And so with that in mind, I decided to do the exact opposite. But nevertheless, the question always appears, and it appears not only in school. It appears when we go to synagogue, for the high holidays, for example. We can't imagine a synagogue without police protection all the time. When my son, my elder son, who's now here in the audience, will start bar mitzvah classes soon. So I know that when he will be going to the classes, he will have to go through the different security. The other thing that I would say is that I think that there's not one single family, Jewish family in Europe, who has not thought about whether they're actually responsible parents of continuing to stay and live in Europe. Most European Jews have at some point or the other asked themselves whether it's not better to leave to Israel, to the United States, elsewhere. Most don't, but I think we all have this in our mind. And lastly, what I would say is that I think, and this was also something that was asked in this poll, in the AJC poll, is the things that we get used to, the normal that we have in Europe. And the normal, for example, is the fact that we don't put, I have decided not to put a mezuzah on my door. Not only at home, but I also have decided not to put up a mezuzah at the AJC Paris office where I live. Because I don't want to run the risk of potentially putting in danger myself and our team. When I'm in a car, in an Uber, in a taxi, I have come up with incredible code words for the word Israel. Or Jewish, that my interlocutors mostly know. So I will never use the word Israel or Jewish with an Uber driver or a taxi. So this is the unfortunate reality that we have to face. And it is a reality that has become normal for us, meaning that it is only when I'm being questioned, it's only when I'm asked that I realize that this normal is actually not normal.
Simone, you, as you said, live in Paris, and what we've seen in recent years is this convergence of different sources of anti-Semitism from the far right, the hard left, and certain corners of the Muslim community. I wonder if you could share a little bit about how those sources of anti-Semitism have come into play, particularly with regard to the yellow vest movement and the protests that we've seen in recent years.
So, first of all, I'll start out a little bit with the beginning. Most of you have probably seen that anti-Semitism started out in the in the last few years. It has made its way to the press. You've seen, of course, the different anti-Semitic murders that have happened in France. But the reality is that the anti-Semitism that we have seen over the last years, whether it's the murder of an elderly Holocaust survivor or the murders of Hyper Cacher, it actually started nearly 20 years ago. And you rightly point out that there are 3 sources. But the one source that kills and that has killed in France, and I know it's not an easy one to face, is the fact that there are all jihadists and there are all Islamists. So there are actually 17 Jews who have been killed over the past 13 years. All of them have been killed by jihadists and Islamists. Now, how it comes together, and you rightfully pointed out the Yellow Vest movement, is that there is a very unhealthy conversion of these 3 forms of anti-Semitism. I just mentioned the Islamist one, but you also have a phenomenon where people who have a feeling of anti-system, and that was very much the Yellow Vest movement. I don't know if all of you have followed this, you know, these protesters who went into the streets of Paris and all over France, who expressed the feeling of unhappiness with a certain tax that had been imposed on them. And it was a social movement. It was originally a social movement. And it ended up bringing together people from the far right, people from the far left, and Islamists. And very quickly, rather than actually being concerned about the tax that had been imposed of them, or social justice, you would find things about the Rothschilds who are trying to control France, or the Zionists who are trying to control France. So I think what this demonstrated is the fact that these three forms of anti-Semitism, meaning the one coming from the far right, the one coming from the far left that mostly focuses on anti-Zionism, and the Islamists, come to have nothing in common whatsoever, but they have one thing in common, which is the hatred of Jews. So this, I think, is the very dangerous phenomenon. And for now, it has calmed down, but there is definitely the potential of it coming back at some point again.
Thank you. Daniel, Simone related to the Zionists, and you spent a lot of time in the European Union's institutions, hobnobbing with European diplomats and elected leaders. I wonder if you could talk about the way in which Israel figures into the conversation around Jews, and specifically around anti-Semitism in Europe today.
The anti-Semitism that comes from the left and focuses on Israel, and also the anti-Semitism from the Muslim community, is for us in our work the most difficult to approach and the most difficult to make progress on in convincing policymakers and decision makers that they need to take these threats just as seriously. And in the European case, when we talk about Islamist or anti-Semitism among the Muslim communities, actually, when it comes to violent attacks, the most serious issue. And that's because many people, including in the Jewish community, sort of think of anti-Semitism as a subcategory of racism, and therefore something that has only something to do with right-wing, far-right ideology. And of course, also the Holocaust overshadows everything else that has occurred in history. But we should not be blind to history. We need to realize that obviously even right-wing, racist, anti-Semitism is a relative new phenomenon of the late 19th century. We have had more or less 2,000 years of Christian-based anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism has two features that separate it from other forms of hatred or racism. One is what has been likened to a virus, the adaptation to the changing societies, the idea that the reasons for anti-Semitism can adjust. Whatever any society in any given moment finds particularly hateful, they project it onto the Jews. So it was a Christ killer in more Christian times, and they were all capitalists for communists, and communists for capitalists. Subhuman for racist, not white for racist, and not for the far left, as we see too white, as we see also in the discussion here in the United States, where Jews are suddenly redefined as privileged white oppressors. And here we come to the issue of Israel. The left always had a stream of anti-Semitism, just as the far right. We can go back to beginning with Karl Marx, who spoke of Jews whose real religion is money. The anarchist in the French tradition, Proudhon, who had like a description for what to do with the Jews, including extermination that could have fit into the Nazi program. And of course, today's anti-Zionism follows the steps and the template of what we found in Stalinist Soviet Union and afterwards. The Soviet Union invented Zionism using traditional anti-Semitism, the protocols, even Mein Kampf as a template, and just exchanged Jews with Zion. This is where today's far left is. Some of them may not realize that what they are doing is actually anti-Semitic. That's one of the issues that is so difficult with the left, that of course in their self-perception, they may actually believe it, they by definition cannot be racist, let alone anti-Semitic, because they are on the left, they are for justice and so forth. But Israel has, for the far left, replaced the Jew. And it is again typical for not just what this society hates the most, in this case nationalism. So before that, Jews were disliked because they were rootless, cosmopolitan. Now they are disliked because they have too deep roots. They are nationalists. But because we are still trapped, many people are trapped in this concept that anti-Semitism is exclusively almost a phenomenon on the right. It is very, very difficult to make progress. We have made progress, though, thanks to the work that we all have done, including our colleagues in Berlin and in Rome and in Prague and in Sofia, where we have offices. We have been able, at some level, for policymakers and decision makers to understand the central role that Israel now plays in far left anti-Semitism, that in many ways, because it's hiding itself, is far more insidious in many ways. So the European Parliament and the European Council, which is where all the member states get together in the EU, have endorsed what we have long promoted, namely the so-called IRA working definition, that is a definition of anti-Semitism that specifically includes these modern left-wing forms of anti-Semitism that are centered around Israel. It was a very uphill struggle, but we have managed, at least at a certain level of decision-making, for them to no longer be able to deny the existence of this part of anti-Semitism. But it is still, of course, a long way to go to see this implemented. And particularly, Simone, you can talk about
sure.
what the role French politicians have also played here.
Yeah, just to make it a little bit, to add to what Daniel just said regarding the working definition. Now, why is the working definition of anti-Semitism so important? It explicitly states when, let's put it that way, anti-Zionism becomes anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. When the border is being crossed, when the criticism of Israel or the hatred of Israel actually becomes something entirely different. So that's why it's important. It's of course a very important political statement, because it means that governments recognize and admit when that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and when the border is being crossed. And it also allows very concretely for governments, once the working definition is implemented, to actually prosecute people, to train policemen, to be able to, in the education ministries, to apply it in schools. And I'll give you one example. A few years ago in Wuppertal in Germany, and as you can probably hear, both of us actually German, which I don't think is a coincidence. Anyhow, in Wuppertal, there was an attack, a firebomb against a mosque, against a synagogue. And the court made a decision arguing that it was not anti-Semitism, it wasn't a hate crime, because it was the legitimate expression of a political frustration, a political statement against Israel. Now, of course, this is absurd, but this would have not been possible if the working definition had been adopted at that point. Now, nevertheless, it's still an uphill battle. We have now 14 countries who have adopted the working definition. But I give you an example. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, made the statement 8 months ago that the working definition was to be adopted. Parliament is supposed to be implementing and adopting it. They have been arguing for month and month and month now, for 8 months, and because it's not a popular move. And they know that their own constituencies sometimes will not like it. So it's still an uphill battle. I think we will get there. President Macron himself gave it another push by saying yesterday that it should be. But it's a difficult push. So yeah, we still have many countries to go, but I think we have made substantial progress in getting different countries, those 14 European countries, to adopt the working definition.
It's quite clear that AJC's advocacy for the IRA working definition has garnered many successes in numerous European countries, but I'd like to focus specifically on some of the work being done by AJC in France and in Paris. One of the things that the Paris office has focused on so much has been the issue of hate speech, particularly online hate speech. You had an entire campaign that sought to raise awareness of hate speech online and efforts to combat it. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So sure. First of all, let me go a step back. I don't think social media, the internet, are amazing. It allows for people to communicate, it allows for people to get informed. But it also has potential and actual real problems. The reality today is, and studies have proven it, that hate online actually produces concrete results, meaning people getting killed, people getting beaten up, because of the kind of things that they see online. We did a study a few years ago in which we really saw that that young people in particular who get all of their information online have a higher tendency to be racist, anti-Semitic, etc. Now, that being said, there are things I think that we can do to proactively do something about it. The first is the fact that we can use the internet. We have all of our offices have social media accounts. AJC now has, I think you know better than I, 2 million?
About 2 million followers.
2 million followers. All of our European offices have extensively been working online. And we have, I think, created very impactful campaigns. So, for example, on the issue of anti-Zionism and on Zionism, we have created a campaign called Mot pour Mot, meaning words against ills, in which we sort of showcase that anti-Zionism kills. Now, we released this about 10 days ago, and within 24 hours, we got more than 50,000 views. So we see the extent to which this, when you proactively do something about it, it can actually have impact. And I believe that one of the reasons why potentially the Parliament will at the end adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism is also because we have created, a little bit of online pressure, if you may say so, on Parliament, where people are starting to interrogate, write to their elected officials and saying, listen, we have a problem, you need to adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism. So I think there is the real potential of using it in our advantage. But I also think, and I know that Daniel and I not always agree on that, that I also think that at some point we will have to have a conversation, in particular between the United States, in which free speech, of course, is protected by the First Amendment, and Europe, on how to actually create a constructive dialogue on on what to do about hate online. Meaning, we apply very different rules in the virtual world than we do in the actual world. Everybody would be outraged if the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal would, publish every single day articles where, it said, you know, kill the Jews or kill the Arabs or whatever. It's the kind of things that you see every single day on social media. So the question is, how can we find a way to create a constructive dialogue? Because at the end of the day, all of those social media companies, whether they're Facebook, Twitter, Google, all of them are here in the United States. They are protected by the First Amendment. So how can we actually make sure that at some point we create a constructive dialogue with taking into consideration, of course, the First Amendment, but how can we create a constructive conversation between both sides of the Atlantic? Because unfortunately, it has very concrete negative results.
Daniel?
Actually, on this point, we don't disagree. When it comes to direct calls to violence and murder, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I'm not sure, I don't think that's even protected under the First Amendment. Where I do disagree is about the idea of restricting hate speech, because what is hate speech? Now we can all probably agree on what it is, but it is ultimately in the eye of the beholder, and I'm much more a believer, although I was raised under a much more restrictive European approach to free speech, where, you know, in Germany, as a result of having committed the Holocaust, now denying the Holocaust is already a punishable crime. But I do believe in the free marketplace of ideas, that this is absolutely necessary to preserve our democracy and to preserve our freedom. And I'm very specifically worried because in Europe, it is already used, the idea of limiting free speech under the guise of trying to prevent hate speech, to prevent an open discussion about radical Islam and anti-Semitism within the Muslim community. So on this specific issue, it can actually backfire very concretely, but I think also very generally, it's obviously a slippery slope. Trying to define what is hate speech and what is still permissible is very difficult. I would keep it on, you know, calls for violence, murder obviously is no longer protected, but anything below that I would not touch, as much as it would aggravate us.
We'll have the argument after.
We'll go backstage and duke it out there. I want to ask a question actually of both of you, and that is, as you think about your work with AJC and you look at your agenda, what more needs to be done? When you walk into a government office, when you engage with a civil society leader, what more needs to be done on the part of European leaders, public opinion figures, in order to stem the tide of European anti-Semitism? Simone.
So before answering your question, let me tell you what I believe has been done so far. First of all, I think we have wasted many, many, many years and many, many lives. AJC was the first organization that came to France, because this is where it really sort of became very apparent, in the early years of 2000, to speak to government leaders. At the time, the president was Jacques Chirac, and tell him that Jewish communities were concerned, that there was violence, that they were fearing for their lives. And the response was, this is not anti-Semitism, we don't have a problem of anti-Semitism, I know my country better than anyone else. And it has really taken us many, many, many years too many years to really sort of get government leaders to understand what the problem is. Not only what the problem is, but also what is at stake for European governments themselves. Because at the end of the day, anti-Semitism is not a problem for Jews. You know, contrary to the 30s and 40s, we can leave. Anti-Semitism is a problem that starts small and that ends up spreading to the rest of society. So at the end of the day, it will affect everybody else. So it took us, first of all, I think, many years to get them to understand The second thing that I think took them many years to understand is to admit where the anti-Semitism came from. As Daniel rightfully pointed out, it's very, very easy, relatively easy for European government leaders to say when anti-Semitism comes from the far right. We've had demonstrations, thousands of people in the streets, when even a cemetery was just desecrated. But it's much more complicated when anti-Semitism comes from within a minority in the European society. A minority that itself is either potentially or actually facing racism. And so there was sort of political correctness, and people were shying away from the fact that anti-Semitism existed. But I think we made a huge amount of progress on that, particularly because we didn't let it go. We did studies, we showed examples, we demonstrated that that was a reality. The third thing I think where we made progress is that we got government leaders to appoint in certain countries particular, let's call them commissioners. We now have a European commissioner on anti-Semitism, we have a commissioner in Germany on anti-Semitism, we have a commissioner in France on anti-Semitism. Meaning a person who specifically only looks at that particular subject and wants to make sure that actually the country is being takes the issue seriously. But there is still a long way to go. The first thing I would say is that we have to end the period of conferences. We have had many conferences, and it's become sort of the new thing, where government leaders convene these great conferences on anti-Semitism. It's nice, don't get me wrong, it's good that they do this, but the real question now is, what is the action plan? What are you going to do? How are you going to make sure that Jewish communities are protected? How are you making sure that the sources of anti-Semitism are combated, which are, of course, Islamist extremism, which are, of course, political extremism on the far left and on the far right? And lastly, what I would say is, and this is something that is very close to my heart, is how can we make sure that coalition partners speak out? So again, on this, I think we have made substantial progress. We have brought non-Jewish organizations to the table. We have, incited them and worked with them very closely to help them to speak out. But I think one aspect that is very important is how do we get, in particular, Muslim leaders to speak out, to condemn anti-Semitism, to fight anti-Semitism more combatively. Again, on this we have made progress as well. We have in particular in France and Germany brought together a group of French Muslims and European Muslims who have been very outspoken for some of them. Most of them have traveled with us through a program that we are doing that is called Project Interchange to Israel, because also, of course, the anti-Zionism is not only sort of a way of looking at Israel, but it's also a construction of how they see the world. So once they go to Israel, once they understand that, the world as they used to see it, the way they used to see Israel is different, many, many things fall apart. And so some of those leaders have been very, very outspoken. I'm thinking in particular of one whose name is Amin El-Khatmi, who actually is now currently brought out a book in which he extensively speaks about anti-Semitism coming from within the Muslim community. But if I had the possibility, I would take dozens and hundreds of Muslims to Israel, and I would work with them very, very closely, as we do here in the United States, in particular through our Muslim Jewish Council.
Thank you, Simone. Daniel?
As Simone rightly said, the progress that we've made so far is making policymakers acknowledge that we have a problem and making them acknowledge that it comes from various sources, giving them a some of the tools, such as a definition, to first of all, we need to define it before and recognize it before we can actually do something about it. But now it's about the implementation. What are we going to do with the growing Muslim community in Europe, where many of, particularly the recent immigrants, come from countries where anti-Semitism was a state ideology? How do you make sure that these people become good Europeans? That includes, to the extent that they have adopted anti-Semitism as a result of the brainwashing they've received, that they get rid of it, that they adopt our Western values, not just on anti-Semitism, but on equality of gender and sexes and so forth. And here I think most governments are still at a loss to even, first of all, quantify the problem. How widespread is anti-Semitism? This is something that Ursula Simon in her office is trying to do because governments refuse to do these studies because they are still afraid to have some shocking results about how widespread anti-Semitism may be among some of these communities. What do you do with these parallel societies that have sprung up throughout Europe? How do you integrate communities when the classrooms in which the kids are going don't reflect the society at large, but reflect the parallel society? None of these questions have even begun to be answered. And on the far left, again, I think that what we need is for the elite, for policymakers, decision makers, opinion makers, to speak up, not just against the anti-Zionism, but to speak up to help create the true and positive image of Israel, to not just focus or look at Israel through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that prism is often very much one-sided, but to look at Israel sui generis as a state that has a lot to offer, and that is an innovation leader, a cultural leader, and at the same time also a state that is under threat. So I would like, and I think it's necessary in order to create a different culture and a different perception in Europe for this process to happen. Because ultimately also the idea that we can compartmentalize these different forms of anti-Semitism, as Simona said, you know, if you look at the far left and the far right, it's not a spectrum. It's, as has been often described, more as a shoehorn or as a full circle. So if we only touch on one side of the debate, we don't only allow the other side to continue to grow. There's cross-fertilization. Just a few weeks ago, to give you an example, in the West German town of Dortmund, a group of neo-Nazis marched through the streets screaming, "Palestine, help us, Israel still exists." And again, they have realized that you can speak about Israel the way you can no longer speak about Jews. And you just replace Jews with Israel or Zion. Another far-right party in Germany transformed the slogan, the Nazi slogan, "The Jews are our misfortune," into "Israel is our misfortune." And we need not just to push back, we need a much more positive debate about Israel in Europe, the way you still have it in the United States. And so those are, if I would have to set priorities, these are the most important issues for me right now.
In just a few moments, we're going to open the floor to questions. If you have any, make sure that you write it down. And we will have individuals walking around with microphones. But before we get to that, I want to ask you to, having experienced anti-Semitism and the sense of insecurity for quite a few years, yourselves as Europeans, as European Jews, what lessons can we in America learn from the European Jewish experience? Simone?
So first of all, let me start out by saying that I'm concerned for the United States. Maybe it's because I'm a paranoid European Jew. It's possible. certainly am. But nevertheless, I'm concerned. I see certain signs now here in the United States that I did see early on in Europe. Of course, it expresses itself in very different ways. But nevertheless, I mean, when you look at American campuses, when you look at the BDS movement, when you look at the intersectionality movement, when American students can't participate at a Black Lives Matter movement, but are obliged to sign on a discharge that they are not Zionists. When an American congresswoman can make statements about Jews and money and ultimately get away with it. When we had Pittsburgh, when Jews are not only being killed on European soil but also on American soil, I get very concerned. So I have, from my perspective, I have a few lessons. First and foremost, the first one is in particular for American Jews, don't be complacent. Be worried, be paranoid. It doesn't matter. Even if people think you're crazy, even if people think you are paranoid, it doesn't matter. I remember times when the French Jewish community was afraid of really speaking out because they didn't want to be seen as always causing problems, and they didn't want to be seen as always, drawing too much attention to themselves. So they would stay silent. So the first one is really don't be complacent. Take on the very, very early signs and fight it hard. The second one is get government leaders, and I think this is what AJC does effectively in the United States and abroad, get government leaders to recognize the issue, speak out, and create specific actions against anti-Semitism. The third, I would say, and then I'll let Daniel, because I don't want to take on the floor too much, is recognize all forms of anti-Semitism. Too often in the American debate, I see people throwing political balls at each other. The right will say the problem is the anti-Semitism on the left will say the anti-Semitism is on the right. Anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism, full stop. And all the others, if you're doing that, you're just playing political games. You're not actually serious about combating anti-Semitism. So all forms of anti-Semitism need to be fought.
Thank you.
I can only underline what Simona said. If anything, I'm even more paranoid than her. We have a good friend in Brussels who survived as a hidden child in Belgium, and he would say the optimists went to Auschwitz and the pessimists went to New York. And for me personally, as a Jew in Europe, two insurance policies. One is Israel and one is the United States, and as I said, I'm very worried. I see very, very similar trends here that we have all witnessed in Europe, particularly, as Simona said, when it comes to identifying and clearly recognizing anti-Semitism when it comes from the far left or when it comes from within the Muslim community or other minority communities. So this is really, really absolutely important to speak out. I know this is generally in the United States a community of tikkun olam, but I think it's about time to also really focus on if we are not for ourselves, then who will be? And so we really need to be, unfortunately, at the forefront of it. Otherwise, it won't happen. And I would say, first of all, everybody personally can participate. I think if I were now in a situation where my kid has to go to college soon, I would look very, very carefully at the universities, and I would not spend a lot of money on sending my kids to a school where anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is being tolerated or even encouraged by allowing them to give commencement speeches, as happened in this city. I would make very, very careful decisions on where I donate my money for philanthropy. Are these really causes and institutions and organizations that also take care of fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And I would also, frankly, as a former Wall Street Journal person, look very carefully at what newspapers I subscribe to and whether they indeed are, printing or not printing anti-Semitic cartoons and cover Israel in a fair way. And I think the last point is there's strength in numbers. Join a good organization. I have a few ideas if you don't know yet which to join. But indeed, be active also in a larger community. I think that will give you strength not to be alone. It's not easy to confront somebody at the water cooler or at a dinner party. It takes courage to do that, particularly if you find yourself to be a lonely voice. But by joining an organization, it will give you the strength to do this.
Thank you very, very much. Now we have two staff members walking with microphones.
So the question was about Emmanuel Macron was present yesterday, and AJC Paris was as well, for the opening of the European Center for Judaism. Listen, it's an incredible project. It's in the middle of Paris. It's a cultural center, it's a synagogue, it's an education center. It's huge, it's beautiful, it's visible. It's a very important statement that shows and demonstrates, as have said several politicians, including Emmanuel Macron, including President François Hollande, including President Nicolas Sarkozy, that France without its Jews would not be France anymore, and that Europe is intrinsically linked with the destiny of Jews. So it's a very, very important statement. Now, is it enough? I don't think so. But it's a very important political statement.
I noticed the title is Global Anti-Semitism, the Hate That Won't Die. There are Mormons, Buddhists, atheists, Catholics, and Protestants. Why don't we retitle this to The Hate That Won't Die? And not just anti-Semitism.
The hate that won't die. Listen, first of all, yes, I believe that all forms of hate need to be combated. But I also think that we need to be very specific when we speak about anti-Semitism. Daniel rightfully pointed out earlier on, speaking about the difference between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Conceptually, I'll give you a demonstration of that. Racism is usually a way in which the visible, the black, the Muslim, the visible, is being seen as inferior. Jews are usually the exact opposite. They are the invisible that potentially is given superpowers, negative aspects about their character, and that need to be eliminated. That's how genocide happens. And so I think there are very different approaches, and I don't think they can be addressed in the same way. That's about the specificity about anti-Semitism. Second, let's be very clear. When you look about anti-Semitism in Europe, and specifically, for example, about France, out of all hate crimes, 50% of all violent hate crimes are of anti-Semitic nature. For a population that represents less than 1% of the entire French population. So I think there is a specific problem of anti-Semitism, and it needs to be dealt with in a very, very specific way. That being said, I mean, yes, hate needs to be combated, and I don't think you will find any Jewish organization in Europe that is not committed in combating hate and racism in general. But I nevertheless believe that anti-Semitism needs to be combated in a very specific way. And third, if I just might add, anti-Semitism is usually the sign of a larger problem. I know David Harris, who's in the audience, hates that comparison, but it's the canary in the coal mine. It starts with the Jews, it doesn't end there. And it is very, very specific to anti-Semitism.
Thank you.
Not much to add on this point. This is particularly American Jewish community is known for having fought for the civil rights and of many other minorities in this countries and for human rights. We as an organization, we consider ourselves a global human rights organization and often and always speak up on behalf of other persecuted minorities, be they Christians in the Middle East, in favor of recognizing the Armenian genocide or on the Kurds in the Middle East. And I don't think that Jews in general in America have to be ashamed about their role in fighting
in
other
Europe
forms,
neither
in discrimination. But as Simone said, we also have the obligation to look out for ourselves, and there is indeed a very, very urgent need, not because Jewish life is more important, but because anti-Semitism has taken on a much, much more dramatic form, and not just in Europe. And I believe, according to the FBI figures, also in this country, since the 1990s, the Jews are disproportionately the victims of religious hate crimes. So we need to also take care of anti-Semitism as Jews, and we don't need to be ashamed of that.
Today in the New York Times there was an op-ed about Mark Zuckerberg and the role of social media in free speech. And it was very, very troubling to hear what he had to say. And I was just wondering, you brought this up, I think Simone brought up the subject. What can we do about that? How can we encourage someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who's very powerful, to fact-check the materials that is put up on his website?
I didn't read the article in the New York Times today, but yes, I think there is an issue of corporate responsibility. I do believe that companies need to be held accountable. You know, we said Daniel made a passionate speech about free speech. But you know, the reality is that social media companies already censor. Try and post a pair of breasts on Facebook or on Instagram. It will be deleted automatically right away. So you know, there are already certain restrictions. So I believe, yes, that companies have a corporate responsibility. We would not tolerate, you know, I don't know, walking through Times Square, for example, you know, where different messages go, you know, kill the Jews or kill whoever. But we do accept it on social media. So I do believe that these companies have a certain corporate responsibility. Actually, AJC in Europe in particular has engaged in a very constructive dialogue with some of those social media companies. So in particular with Facebook, we have a constant exchange about you know, what kind of strategies can be adopted, what needs to be done in order to train their own personnel whenever content is being removed, what constitutes anti-Semitism, what doesn't, what constitutes hate speech, but what doesn't. But again, I believe what needs to happen now is really sort of a wider dialogue between both sides of the Atlantic, of discussing, you know, how this issue can actually be tackled. And I wouldn't put the social media companies on the side. Quite to the contrary, it can't be a sort of a government to government or NGO to NGO. Those companies need to be included into a wider thinking process on how this issue can be tackled.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions? Yes.
In the age of social media, and where the average attention span has dropped significantly, it's become very difficult to explain the complexities of anti-Semitism to most folks, particularly even folks on the left, who might be otherwise very open to socially conscious and diversity initiatives. So I'm curious how you might go about explaining in a few words to either African Americans or LGBT folks or other people who, like the gentleman mentioned, are particularly not seeing Jews as victims or as vulnerable in the world today.
Indeed, I think part of the problem on the far left is to look at issues such as racism, discrimination, and so forth, exclusively from a socio-economic perspective. They look at inequalities and immediately equate that with discrimination, and where somebody and where inequality doesn't exist, that person is automatically privileged. No doubt, socioeconomically, American Jews are doing fairly well in the United States. But nobody is suggesting that the average American Jew is experiencing discrimination at the workplace the way that maybe African Americans or Latinos are experiencing. But there are other vulnerabilities. We are just commemorating, last week we commemorated the anniversary of an anti-Semitic terror attack. So the fact that somebody's doing socioeconomically well doesn't mean that person is not necessarily being hated simply for what he or she is. And as we have just described, anti-Semitism is unfortunately alive and rising. The experience of anti-Semitism is maybe different sometimes. It manifests itself maybe different than the discrimination that other minorities may experience. But that doesn't deny the authenticity of the fact that the hatred against Jews is unfortunately on the rise.
Yeah, very quickly. Daniel said already most of it. First of all, I think one of the a few things regarding sort of how one can speak to those who don't understand that anti-Semitism is an issue. First of all, I think one of the messages that AJC, I think, has managed to bring across over the years, in particular in Europe, is the fact that anti-Semitism is a symptom. It's a symptom of a deeper problem, and it's not the problem of the Jews. It's the problem that it's a cancer, it's a tumor that will ultimately metastasize to the rest of society. So it's not a Jewish problem. It's a French problem. It's an American problem. It's everybody's problem. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing is that I think it's very important to call out some of those actors in the intersectionality movement in particular, who have pretty successfully, I mean, when I look at people like Linda Sarsour, who have pretty successfully managed to sort of put Jews to the side. You were now, if you want to be part of the women's movement, you suddenly find yourself in bed with someone who says, that that Zionism is incompatible with feminism. So I think those people need to be called out very, very clearly for who they are and for the profoundly racist and anti-Semitic prejudice.
If the two of you could speak about how Jews in Europe feel politically homeless, definitely feels that way in the UK today, and how that might come to pass in the United States in the decades to come.
Regarding the Jews of Europe and their political home, I think overall in Europe it's not so much of the problem, despite the fact that I would say much of the far left and much of the far right definitely have lost the Jews. It's a huge problem in the United Kingdom because the Labour Party, which is one of the two major parties in that country, has become institutionally anti-Semitic under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. For those of you who don't know, Jeremy Corbyn called Hezbollah and Hamas my friends. Jeremy Corbyn has gone to speak to Islamist organizations who call for the killing of Jews in the United Kingdom. And the party itself has become so institutionally anti-Semitic that many Labour Party members, and in particular Jewish Labour Party members, have been obliged to leave the party. So indeed, for those Jews who've always felt close to the left and to the Labour Party, they're now left without a political home. I don't think that is yet the case in the rest of Europe, but there are definitely tendencies, and I would say that there are certain countries where the political far left has definitely lost its Jewish audience.
I have a question. The other day, J Street had a conference in Washington. Senators Warren and Sanders were there, and they both spoke out against Israel and for defunding Israel and for sending the money to the Palestinians. Do you find that something like that troubling, that Israel is in the center of a democratic election?
Many, not just American Jews, but European Jews, feel close to Israel, overwhelmingly support Israel, whatever that may mean. Some might be more critical or less critical of individual government decision, but they very much associate with Israel. And so the idea that Israel is being demonized, that Israel is being described as not just a racist state, but probably the worst racist apartheid state, is something that undermines Jewish identity, both in the United States and in Europe, and obviously in Israel. And given the fact that Israel lives in a very, very dangerous neighborhood, and the American-Israeli military alliance is crucial to its survival, this affects basic security of the state of Israel. So on the one hand, to undermine its legitimacy by demonizing it, and on the other hand, by questioning continued military support for a country that is constantly threatened with destruction, the only state in the entire UN that is threatened with destruction.
I'm very concerned about the politicization of Israel here in the American political debate. Israel needs to be a bipartisan issue. That has always been the strength of the United States. It has always been the strength and the sort of hope for us Europeans when we looked at the United States. So when I see Israel becoming a partisan issue, when I see parts of the Democratic Party sort of, turning their back on Israel, I'm extremely concerned.
Well, on that harrowing note, please join me in thanking our speakers, Daniel and Simone. And now it gives me great pleasure to invite AJC CEO David Harris to conclude our evening.
I want to first of all thank my very esteemed and cherished colleagues, Avi, Simone, and Daniel, for what I hope you will agree was a particularly thought-provoking an educational experience for all of us. I hope you agree. I think that was Simone's son. I also want to thank Temple Emmanuel, and in particular its senior rabbi and my friend Josh Davidson, and its very respected program director of the Stryker Center, Gadi Levy, for partnering with AJC in this two-part series, and I hope you'll be back on the 4th of March for still more. And I do want to acknowledge as well the presence of the president of AJC, Harriet Schleifer, and I will add that the founders of AJC in 1906, who were all associated with Temple Emmanuel, would have been surprised to know that a female is leading the American Jewish Committee, but thankfully that's the case. Allow me a few words on the subject matter before we wrap up for the evening, because this discussion is particularly close to me and to my experience and to my heart. The reason why AJC was the first to see this re-emerging problem in Europe, was frankly in large measure because in the year 2000, my wife, who's sitting here, and two of our children and I took a sabbatical and moved to Geneva, Switzerland. We had fantasized about an idyllic year far from the world's problems and surrounded by the beauty of the country. It turned out to be something quite different. It began in our children's elite Swiss school, where our youngest son experienced anti-Semitism on the campus from an older student, while the school itself disavowed any responsibility or even interest in what happened. It occurred in the same school when one of the few Israeli students was surrounded and humiliated by a group of Arab students. And once again, the school turned its back on the problem, refusing even to acknowledge it. It came about because in the same year, we traveled to London for a long weekend. And in walking around central London, by chance came across a demonstration of several hundred people focused on hatred for Israel, in which we heard, to our dismay, the speaker tell the audience his joke: "What's the difference between a Jew and a pizza?" And after pausing for dramatic effect, said he, "They both go in the oven, but at least the pizza makes no noise." And rather than any of the people in the audience protesting, walking out, they laughed. The only person who challenged the speaker, as it turned out, was my wife. Who, to the speaker's dismay, suddenly found my wife from the edge of the crowd on stage, in his face, speaking to him in his native Arabic, which is her native language, in a way that he could never have imagined, much less coming from a woman. We saw it in the year 2000, 2001, because we began to collect media stories and cartoons from mainstream newspapers in France, in Spain, in Switzerland, in Italy, and other countries, in which Israel was not only demonized, the Holocaust was inverted, where suddenly the Gaza Strip became the new Warsaw Ghetto, where the Palestinian child became the new Jesus on the crucifix, and where the IDF became the new Wehrmacht, if not SS or Gestapo. I'm talking mainstream newspapers in Europe and not fringe. And we saw it because Geneva is home to the United Nations in Europe, home to the oddly named UN Human Rights Council, which more often than not is the UN Human Wrongs Council, and where we saw Jews and Israel being vilified, demonized, assailed daily, while the world's most egregious human rights violators were safely protected by the numerical majority. And to give you a sense, 2 years after we left Geneva, the Libya of Muammar Gaddafi was elected the chair of the UN Human Rights Council. That's the body. That's what we saw up close, day after day. And so, as Simone said, we, including me, began visiting governments in Europe, governments we knew well. AJC is the diplomatic arm of the Jewish people. We went to visit Jacques Chirac, the president, as Simone said, as friends of Europe, as Francophiles. And we explained to him there's a growing problem. And Jews in France, the largest community in Europe, are feeling increasingly vulnerable and are beginning to question whether the government will protect them. And his answer, and the answer still rings in my ears because he spoke in French, mais mes amis, je vous assure, il n'y a pas d'antisémitisme ici en France. Je connais mon pays mieux de vous. My friends, I assure you, there is no anti-Semitism in France. I know my country better than you. And we had this conversation more than once with Jacques Chirac. And I remember vividly in November of 1991, 2 months after 9/11, meeting with the foreign ministers of France, Spain, and Italy together to discuss this subject because Jacques Chirac had asked his foreign minister to continue the conversation with AJC and persuade us. The foreign minister at the time was named Hubert Védrine. And the minister, while the other two were nodding their heads vigorously in European solidarity, said to us, "You don't understand. What you think is anti-Semitism is in fact hooliganism." And then in a phrase which I will never forget, he said, or it is the, quote, importation of the Arab-Israeli conflict onto French soil. Our response to the minister and his two cheerleaders was, when Jews are attacked as Jews, we're not talking about hooliganism. And no Jew in Europe wanted to import the Arab-Israeli conflict and play it out in an intifada in Europe. So let's be clear. But as Daniel and Simone said, year after year after year, we went back to those leaders and other leaders and spoke as friends, concerned friends, and the answer was, there is no problem. So, as was said on stage here, years were wasted. And there was even more. I'll just mention one other thing. I was asked to speak at Mauthausen, the Nazi concentration camp in Austria a few years ago at a major event. I was the fifth of 6 speakers. The first speaker was the president of Austria. Then came the president of Poland. Then came the president of Hungary. Then came the chairman of the Russian parliament, the Duma. And then came me. The first 4 ritualistically, dutifully, respectfully spoke about Mauthausen of the wartime years. I listened carefully, and never once did I hear in any of their 4 speeches the word Israel mentioned. Nor did I hear a single reference to contemporary anti-Semitism. So when it was my turn, I had as many notes as I have here right now. And in a very politically perhaps incorrect fashion, I said to that audience of over 1,000 dignitaries, including those presidents, I'm not interested in witnessing tears about dead Jews unless there's concern about living Jews. Unless and until the Europeans who ritualistically go through the January 27th Holocaust commemorations and bow their heads and act appropriately lift their heads and open their eyes from January 28th till the following January 26th and spend their time defending living Jews and their right to life. And unless they understand that they cannot banalize, trivialize, assail, vote against Israel time after time after time unfairly because it's politically convenient, without even a shred of understanding either of Israel's reality or its meaning in a post-Holocaust world to the Jews, I'm not interested in those events. And the fundamental difference we told the Europeans was, in 1938, when my parents were trapped in Europe, there was nowhere to go. There was nowhere to go. Not here, not to Latin America, or elsewhere for them. Eventually, my mother managed to get out on one of the last ships before Pearl Harbor. After 17 months in hiding, my father only came after the war. This time, there is a place to go for European Jews if they need to go. And they will go if they need or have to go. But where will Europe go? Where will Europe go, not geographically, but metaphysically? The Europe that after the war adopted the noble values of the protection of human dignity. Where will it go? And so our business plan from the start, 19 years ago until today, and you heard it from my colleagues, first and foremost was not what we can do to save the Jews and protect the Jews of Europe, but what can you, the governments that have the power, that have the police and the judiciary and the intelligence and the educational system, what will you do? Because if you don't act, Jews will determine their own destiny, and Europe will be left with a sorry fate. I want to make an appeal to you before closing. And it's an appeal that's very personal. Where is the anger? Where is the anger? Where is the anger that Sarah Halimi, a Holocaust survivor of the generation and the experience of my mother, who ended up in Lisbon like my mother, and who came back to France after the war believing that the country of liberty, equality, and fraternity would protect her, was stabbed 11 times and her home was burned. Where's the anger? Where's the anger when member states of UNESCO sitting in Paris, their headquarters, strip us, the Jewish people, of our identity by vote, deny us our historical connection to Israel? Where is the anger? Where is the anger that Jews in Malmö, Sweden, have fled in large numbers because they no longer feel safe on the streets of what was once one of the most progressive countries on the planet? And where's the anger after that story at Wuppertal, the synagogue? I want to be sure you understood the story. The Palestinians who attacked the synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany, claimed that their grievance was against Israel. And since there was no Israeli target in the neighborhood, it was legitimate for them to attack a synagogue. Where is our anger? And I don't even speak about Pittsburgh and Poway and university campuses and random Jews in Brooklyn and elsewhere being attacked for the simple fact that they're Jews. If our behavior doesn't change tomorrow morning, then I dare say that this evening will have been welcome, but insufficient. We need to stand together. We need to stand with others, and AJC spends a great deal of our time looking for those others here and abroad. But first and foremost, we need to stand together and understand what's at stake. None of us expected this. The last thing my mother expected before she passed away a year ago was to hear from the streets of France or Toulouse, mort aux Juifs, death to the Jews. The last thing in the world that I expected was to have to worry about our granddaughter going to a Chabad school on East 77th Street. But after the attack in Poway, who can shed concern about all of this? So we can look away, we can live in denial, we can pretend it's not us, or conversely, we can stand together, arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, join with others, and defend what is not just our own destiny, but the destiny of liberal democracy. AJC is one such platform that we offer to you that allows us, whether on 65th Street or elsewhere, to connect with the world and stand and defend and advocate and project onto the world what we believe. I hope you'll stand with us. We need you, and if you allow me the chutzpah, I dare say you need us. We need each other. Thank you for being here tonight, and good night.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. And we're especially pleased to remind you that thanks to a generous matching gift from the Cayley family, every new or increased dollar you donate to JBS will be worth double to JBS. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.